The first night, Ella Fitzgerald performed at the Mocambo Club, November 1955. The audience was different from what she was used to. Not the black jazz clubs where she'd built her reputation, not the segregated venues that allowed black performers but seated black audience members in separate sections. This was Hollywood royalty, white and wealthy and powerful, the people who decided which performers became stars and which remained invisible regardless of talent. And seated directly in front of the stage, exactly as she'd promised, was Marilyn Monroe. Not hiding in a back booth, not arriving late to avoid attention, but front row center in a dress that ensured every photographer in the room would capture her presence. The message was unmistakable. If Marilyn Monroe, the most photographed woman in America, thought Ella Fitzgerald was worth watching, then everyone else should pay attention too. The photographs from that week ran in newspapers and magazines across the country, and they didn't just show Ella performing, they showed Marilyn watching, visibly engaged, applauding, treating Ella's performance with the same respect typically reserved for opera singers or classical musicians. Within months, Ella's career trajectory changed completely. The venues that had been closed to her suddenly opened. The television shows that had only wanted her voice on recordings now wanted her visible presence. She went from being a successful black artist working within the constraints of segregation to being an international star who could perform anywhere. And the story that emerged was presented as simple generosity. Marilyn Monroe helped her friend Ella Fitzgerald by using her fame to open doors. But that narrative erases the most important element of what actually happened. Marilyn didn't just help a friend. She weaponized her white privilege, deliberately and strategically, to undermine a racist system that was designed to keep talented black performers invisible to white audiences who might have paid to see them. She understood something that most white liberals of her era didn't grasp, that good intentions and moral positions were worthless without power, and that she had power that could be leveraged specifically because she was white, blonde, famous, and willing to use those attributes as tools rather than accidents. Before we explore this untold story of strategic activism in 1950s Hollywood, if you're interested in the hidden histories behind iconic figures, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Hollywood in 1955 operated under a racial caste system that was as rigid as anything in the segregated South, but more insidious because it pretended not to exist. There were no signs declaring whites only on the Sunset Strip's famous nightclubs. There were no laws explicitly forbidding black performers from appearing at venues like the Mocambo, Cyro's, or the Troubadour. Instead, there was an unspoken understanding among club owners that booking black entertainers meant risking white clientele, and white clientele was what made establishments profitable. The mathematics of racism were brutally simple. White audiences would buy records by black artists, would listen to their music on the radio, would even attend their performances in designated black venues. But seeing a black performer in a white space created a psychological discomfort that club owners believed would drive away business. This wasn't explicit hatred, they would have insisted. This was just business reality, understanding your customer base, and what white audiences wanted, apparently, was to enjoy black artistry without having to acknowledge black humanity. Ella Fitzgerald had been navigating this system since the 1930s. She'd started singing with Chick Webb's orchestra when she was 17, had developed a vocal technique and range that made her arguably the finest jazz singer alive by the mid-1940s. Her recordings sold millions, her voice was everywhere on radio, but she remained largely invisible to mainstream white audiences, confined to black clubs and segregated venues, unable to break through to the level of fame her talent should have guaranteed. The cruel irony was that white audiences already loved Ella Fitzgerald's voice. They just didn't want to see her body, didn't want to be reminded that the sound they enjoyed came from a black woman who deserved the same respect they automatically granted to white performers. The entertainment industry had designed a system that allowed white Americans to consume black artistry while maintaining the fiction of racial superiority. Black performers could make white people rich through record sales, but they couldn't claim the visibility and cultural cachet that would position them as equals. By 1955, Ella had been trapped in this system for 2 decades. She'd achieved everything possible within the constraints of segregation, had become the most respected vocalist in jazz, had financial security and professional recognition. But there was a ceiling, invisible but absolute, that kept her from the mainstream breakthrough that would have been automatic for a white singer with 1/10 of her ability. The major clubs on Sunset Strip remained closed, not through posted signs but through the quiet consensus of club owners who valued white comfort over black excellence. This was the system that Marilyn Monroe decided to disrupt in November 1955, not through protest or petition, but through a calculated use of her own privileged position in ways that made racism more expensive than integration. The exact details of the phone call between Marilyn Monroe and Charlie Morrison, owner of the Mocambo Club, have been lost to history. What remains are the accounts from both women about what happened. Marilyn had been introduced to Ella's music in 1954, had become a genuine admirer, and had been shocked to learn that someone of Ella's caliber couldn't get booked at the prestigious clubs where Marilyn herself was always welcome. The injustice was obvious, but so was the leverage point. Marilyn understood the economics of nightclub booking. Club owners wanted celebrities in their audiences because celebrities guaranteed photographers, and photographers guaranteed publicity, and publicity guaranteed packed houses. If Marilyn Monroe promised to be in the audience every night that Ella performed, then suddenly the calculation changed entirely. It wasn't about whether white audiences would accept a black performer. It was about whether any club owner could afford to turn down the guaranteed business that Marilyn Monroe's presence would bring. So she made the offer to Charlie Morrison, in terms he couldn't refuse: book Ella Fitzgerald for a week, and Marilyn would sit front row center every single night. Not occasionally, not if her schedule permitted, but every night without exception. She'd arrive early enough for photographers to capture her entrance. She'd sit where she'd be visible throughout the performance. She'd make it clear through her presence that Ella Fitzgerald deserved the same respect as any performer in Hollywood. Morrison agreed immediately, not because he'd overcome his racist assumptions, but because the business opportunity was too good to refuse. With Marilyn Monroe in the front row, the Mocambo would be the most photographed nightclub in America for a week. The color of Ella's skin became irrelevant compared to the guaranteed profit. The booking was set for November 1955, and Marilyn Monroe, true to her promise, was there every single night. The photographs from that week show Marilyn seated directly in front of the stage, completely absorbed in Ella's performance. These weren't the usual nightclub photos of celebrities pretending to enjoy entertainment while actually socializing. These were photographs of genuine engagement, of Marilyn demonstrating appreciation for artistic excellence, and because Marilyn was watching, everyone else watched too. The photographs sent a message that reverberated through the entertainment industry. If Marilyn Monroe recognized Ella Fitzgerald's brilliance, then perhaps everyone else had been missing something important. This was the genius of Marilyn's strategy, using her own position as underestimated intellect to validate Ella's undervalued artistry. The newspapers that covered the Mocambo booking focused initially on Marilyn's presence, which was exactly what she'd intended, but the photographs showed something those same newspapers couldn't ignore: Ella Fitzgerald commanding the stage with presence and power that transcended any racial categories, and Marilyn Monroe, visible and engaged, provided visual proof that white appreciation of black artistry didn't require segregation or distance. The impact of that 1 week at the Mocambo rippled outward in ways neither woman could have fully anticipated. For Ella Fitzgerald, the immediate effect was validation she'd been denied for 2 decades. The reviews that ran in newspapers weren't confined to entertainment sections or jazz publications. Mainstream critics who'd never paid attention to her before suddenly discovered her existence, writing about her vocal range and technical precision as though these were recent developments rather than qualities she'd been demonstrating since the 1930s. The recording industry suddenly recognized that visibility could increase profits. Within months, she had television appearances lined up, offers from major venues that had previously been closed to her, and a career trajectory that would make her an international star. But the significance went beyond Ella's individual success. Other club owners on the Sunset Strip, watching the Mocambo's business boom during Ella's engagement, realized that integration could be profitable rather than risky. The barrier had been psychological, not economic, and once broken, it revealed itself as nothing more than self-perpetuating prejudice. Within a year, other black jazz performers who'd been confined to segregated venues began getting bookings at the major Sunset Strip clubs, not because club owners had experienced moral awakenings, but because Marilyn Monroe had demonstrated that racism was leaving money on the table. For Marilyn Monroe, the cost and benefit of her action reflected the complexity of being a white ally in a racist system. She received praise for her generosity, was celebrated as proof that Hollywood could be progressive. But she also faced backlash from exactly the people whose prejudices she'd challenged. Some club owners and industry executives began whispering that she was becoming political, that she was stepping outside her appropriate role. Gossip columnists started running items suggesting she was naive, that her friendship with Ella was a publicity stunt. This backlash revealed an uncomfortable truth. When white people use their privilege to challenge racial barriers, they're simultaneously praised for their goodness and punished for their betrayal of white solidarity. Marilyn was supposed to enjoy her white privilege quietly, to benefit from advantages without acknowledging they existed. By explicitly leveraging her whiteness as a tool to open doors for a black performer, she'd broken an unspoken rule. But she also gained something more valuable than industry approval. She demonstrated that power could be used for purposes beyond personal advancement, that privilege could be spent rather than just acknowledged, that systems could be changed through strategic action rather than just good intentions. In the decades since 1955, the story of Marilyn Monroe and Ella Fitzgerald has been retold countless times in the same comfortable framework. Marilyn helped her friend Ella by using her fame to open doors, demonstrating the power of friendship and racial harmony. This narrative appears in biographies, documentaries, and articles. It's heartwarming and inspiring, suggesting that individual kindness can overcome systemic barriers. But this comfortable retelling erases the most important elements of what actually happened. The first thing that gets lost is the calculated nature of Marilyn's action. This wasn't spontaneous kindness. This was strategic activism, carefully planned with full understanding of the entertainment industry's economic structure. Marilyn didn't appeal to Charlie Morrison's conscience because she understood those appeals would fail. She restructured the financial equation to make integration more profitable than segregation. This approach worked precisely because it didn't require Morrison to overcome his racial prejudices. It just required him to prioritize profit over racism. But acknowledging this calculated approach means acknowledging that moral suasion and good intentions aren't enough to change unjust systems. That power has to be leveraged strategically. The second element that gets erased is the specific nature of the privilege Marilyn was leveraging. It wasn't just fame that gave her power. It was whiteness itself, the automatic respect that white performers received. Marilyn's presence at the Mocambo was valuable precisely because she was white, blonde, the epitome of beauty standards and racial hierarchy. A black celebrity promising to sit front row wouldn't have had the same impact. Marilyn understood her whiteness not as an accident to feel guilty about, but as leverage she could spend in ways that challenged the racial hierarchies it was supposed to support. She weaponized white privilege, deliberately and strategically, making it work against the system that had granted her that privilege. The comfortable narrative can't quite handle this level of calculated use of racial advantage, preferring instead to talk about friendship in ways that avoid naming the specific power dynamics that made the intervention successful. The third erasure is perhaps most significant: what this story reveals about how change actually happens in racist systems. The comfortable narrative suggests that individual acts of kindness can overcome structural barriers. But what actually happened at the Mocambo proves the opposite. The barrier fell not because hearts changed, but because someone with privilege was willing to spend that privilege strategically. Charlie Morrison didn't book Ella because he'd overcome his assumptions. He booked her because Marilyn restructured the incentives. The system didn't change because it became more moral. It changed because someone made it change by leveraging power in ways that left gatekeepers no choice. This is threatening for those who prefer to believe that gradual moral progress will eventually lead to justice without requiring the privilege to sacrifice anything significant. Because what Marilyn did suggests that real change requires those with privilege to use that privilege as a weapon, to spend their advantages in ways that might cost them something. The story of Marilyn Monroe and Ella Fitzgerald at the Mocambo has been told for nearly 70 years, but its lessons about privilege and strategic activism remain largely unlearned. The comfortable version emphasizes friendship and kindness, suggesting good people can overcome systemic barriers. But that version erases what made Marilyn's intervention effective: the calculated use of privilege as leverage, the strategic understanding of power dynamics, the willingness to weaponize whiteness against the system that granted it. What Marilyn did wasn't simply be a good friend. She analyzed the economic structure of racial gatekeeping, identified where leverage could be applied, and deployed her privilege to restructure incentives. This approach worked not despite being calculated, but because it was calculated, because it operated within the system's logic. And that's the uncomfortable lesson the comfortable narrative erases. Effective allyship requires strategic analysis and tactical deployment of privilege, not just good intentions. Modern discussions of allyship rarely engage with this level of strategic thinking. There's endless discourse about acknowledging privilege, about listening to marginalized voices, about being aware of advantages. These are necessary starting points, but they're not sufficient for actually changing anything, because acknowledgement without action is just performance. What Marilyn demonstrated was that privilege has to be spent, leveraged in ways that might cost something, used as a weapon against the systems that grant it. The question facing anyone who learns what happened at the Mocambo in November 1955 isn't whether to admire Marilyn Monroe. The question is whether to learn from her example what strategic allyship actually requires: the analysis, the risk, the willingness to spend privilege in ways that might cost something. Because nearly 70 years later, the fundamental dynamics haven't changed as much as comfortable narratives suggest. Talented people from marginalized groups still face barriers that talent alone can't overcome. Systems still maintain themselves through gatekeeping that masquerades as meritocracy. And people with privilege still have choices about whether to acknowledge those systems or actively work to dismantle them. The difference between acknowledgement and action, between guilt and leverage, between feeling progressive and being effective, that difference is what the story of Marilyn Monroe and Ella Fitzgerald actually teaches. Not that friendship transcends racial barriers, but that power can be used strategically, privilege can be weaponized against the systems that grant it, and change requires people with advantages to spend those advantages in ways that might actually cost them something. That's not a comfortable lesson, but it's the only honest one to draw from what happened at the Mocambo Club when Marilyn Monroe decided that her privilege was a tool to be used rather than a guilt to be endlessly acknowledged.